welcome to the next section of the course. In this section, we'll learn about component lifecycle methods. This is a feature that exists only on React class components. So, what is a lifecycle method? Well, a lifecycle method is simply a regular JavaScript method that React runs automatically at some point during a component's existence. So as our component lives, if you will, it undergoes certain important events in its existence. For example, it is mounted onto the DOM. Or another event that it goes through is having its state changed whenever we call something like setState. Or maybe another example is receiving a different value for a prop from the parent component. Or another example is being unmounted, being removed from the DOM. These are all events, or in other words, important occurrences of a component's existence. And what a lifecycle method allows us to do is to hook into that moment, to intercept that moment and say, hey, when this thing is happening to a component or about to happen to a component, React, please run this additional logic for us, right? So we intercept that moment, we do some additional logic. And it's here that we can do things like side effects. So for example, if you think about it, where is the best place for us to do something like reach out to an API to get data? Well, the render method doesn't really feel right because the render method runs every time the component re-renders, and that could be a dozen times. And we obviously don't want to make a dozen API requests every time we re-render the component. So for those types of events or side effects, a perfect place to do that logic is in a lifecycle method. It's this supplementary side method that React will automatically run, and knowing that React will automatically run it, we can put logic in there for React to execute on our behalf. The way this works is super simple. Within our class component definition, we simply define these lifecycle methods in line as regular instance methods, so their names must match the method names that React is expecting. And during that moment of a component's existence, when that method is triggered, React will automatically invoke that method and run the logic that we provide. And if we do not define any methods, that's not a problem. React will simply not run any of our additional logic during that moment in a component's existence. So let me give you two examples here on the next slide. And this is not by any means all of the available lifecycle methods. This is just two to get you thinking. One example is the component didMount lifecycle method, and that is run automatically by React after a component is mounted, which means added to the browser DOM. So the React documentation actually recommends that if we want to make an API request, this is a great place to do so, right? And you might be curious, why do we want to make this request after the component has been mounted rather than before? And the answer is, if our API request takes some time, let's say a really long amount of time, like 10 seconds, well, if we're waiting for the API request to complete, then the user will not see anything because the component will not render until that API request completes. Instead, it's usually a good idea to give the user something such as a bare bones component that is not rendering any data, but may, for example, have a header, and then make the request to the server and repopulate the component or re-render the component when it receives the data. We always want to give the user as much as we can rather than have them wait on a blank screen while we, for example, make an API request. So this is an example of a method that will run as soon as the component will be added to the DOM, as soon as the render method runs and generates that JSX, and it represents a great place for us to do a side effect like reaching out to an API, right? Another example is the component will unmount lifecycle method. And just like its name suggests, this method will run automatically before a component is removed from the DOM. So here is where we can perform some cleanup logic. So for example, if we establish some kind of timer or subscription to the backend or anything that is kind of an ongoing event throughout the existence of our component, this is the place where we can tear down that logic or remove anything that we've created, because we know that React will run this logic whenever the component is removed from the DOM. And these are just two examples. There's other occurrences during a component's existence that may run multiple times. For example, there is a lifecycle method that will run every single time the state changes. And of course, the state may change many different times. The point is that that method will run repeatedly. So some lifecycle methods will run just once, others will run multiple times depending on how the component is interacted with. but the logic remains the same. We define the lifecycle method in our class component, and we tell React what to do at that juncture, at that moment, at that event, right? The reason it's called a lifecycle method is because it's a method that runs at some point during the component's life, at some point during the component's existence. All right, we're going to see how this works in action in a few lessons from now, where we actually make a request to our mock backend. But hopefully this explanation makes sense. And in the very next lesson, we'll start seeing this in action in our code editor. So I will see you there.